Okay, I want you to picture a scene that, honestly, it feels like it's straight out of a movie script. It's the late 1800s. We're in this tiny, rugged village in Armenia. The name is Karakala, and there's an 11-year-old boy, Ephim, sitting at a table.
And we really have to be clear here. Ephim is illiterate, can't read, can't write.
Right. He's a shepherd boy. He's probably never been more than a few miles from his flock. And yet, for 7 days straight, this kid sits and draws these incredibly detailed maps.
And these are not maps of the local hills.
No. He's drawing the Atlantic Ocean, a body of water he has absolutely never seen. He draws the U.S. East Coast, and then he writes a prophecy. He warns everyone a terrible massacre is coming.
A genocide.
Exactly. And he tells all the Christian families you have to flee to America. But then he gets weirdly specific. He says, do not stop on the East Coast. You should go all the way to the West Coast.
Which is such a wild detail, because you think about it, at that time, the West Coast of America, it was basically the frontier. It was nothing compared to New York or Boston. For a boy in an Armenian village to even know it existed, let alone, insist on it as the only safe place, it's baffling.
It sets the tone perfectly.
Yeah.
This sounds like fantasy, but it's the actual historical opening of the source material for our deep dive today. We are getting into The Happiest People on Earth, the biography of Demos Shakarian.
And that title, I think, might throw you off. You hear The Happiest People on Earth and you think it's going to be some, lightweight religious memoir.
Yeah, a bit simplistic.
But it's not. It is this massive, multi-generational saga. We're talking immigration, the Great Depression, the industrialization of agriculture, and this constant clash between old world mysticism and really hard-nosed American capitalism.
It's a total roller coaster. You have these narrow escapes from genocide, the building of a cattle empire, and a global movement that starts in a cafeteria.
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive.
We're exploring a very specific tension in this book. It's the gap between the marketplace and the miraculous. We're looking at how a family that literally fled a Holocaust went on to build the world's largest private dairy.
And how they tried to reconcile making serious, massive profits with this intense spiritual heritage.
Let's start with that heritage, because the mindset is so different from how we think today. We're back in that village, Karakala.
Okay.
The Shakarian family were cattle farmers. They lived in the shadow of Mount Ararat, and they were part of a group people called the Russian Pentecostals.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, these weren't just, casual Sunday churchgoers.
No, not at all. These were people who believed that the supernatural stuff in the Bible prophecy, healing, God speaking directly to you, wasn't just ancient history. It was a functional, everyday reality. They lived by it.
Which brings us to a story that I think just perfectly sums up their entire worldview. It involves Demos's grandfather, also named Demos, and the infamous blind steer. This story is hilarious, but it also kind of sets the rules for the rest of the book.
It really does. So, Grandfather Demos is the patriarch. He wants to throw this huge feast for these visiting Russian Christians to honor them. But being a farmer, he has a practical problem. The biggest, fattest steer he owns, the one with the most meat, has a blemish.
It's blind in one eye, a milk white eye.
Exactly. And in their tradition, which is based on, Old Testament law, you don't offer a blemished animal. It's an insult to God, an insult to your guests.
But he's a businessman.
He's a businessman at heart. He does the math. He needs a lot of meat, so he comes up with this plan. He'll slaughter the steer, chop off the head with the bad eye, and hide it in a sack under some wheat in the barn.
What they don't know won't hurt them.
That's the logic. The meat's good. No one needs to know. It's the classic compartmentalization. What happens in the barn stays in the barn.
Except it doesn't work that way.
Not in this village. So the Russian prophet arrives, they all sit down to eat, and suddenly the prophet just freezes. He stares at Grandfather Demos, gets up, walks straight to the barn, digs through the wheat, pulls out the sack.
Oh, no.
And dumps the head with the blind eye right on the dinner table, in front of everyone.
I can just feel the silence in that room. That is a nightmare.
It's the ultimate you've been caught moment. And the prophet just says, God told me. But the lesson here, and this is crucial for the whole Shakarian story, is you can't hide the blind eye. Integrity is absolute because the spiritual world is always watching the physical one. There are no secrets.
That lesson really stuck with them. And honestly, they needed that kind of trust in the supernatural because that boy prophet, Ephim, eventually comes back to them and says,
The time is now, run.
And this is where it gets chilling. Around 1905, the Shakarians and some other families, they listen. They sell everything, their land, their herds, and they move to Los Angeles. Just a few years later, 1914, the Turkish army sweeps through that region.
And everyone who stayed behind in Karakalla was killed, wiped out in the Armenian genocide.
So they literally owe their lives to listening to a prophecy. But they get to Los Angeles. And let's be real, it's not the land of milk and honey right away.
Oh, not even close. They end up in the flats of LA. It's poverty. Grandfather Demos dies in a railway accident.
Yeah.
Demos's father, Isaac, he's the one who becomes central here. He's working in a harness factory, just breathing in leather dust all day.
The book is so vivid about that dust. It was just destroying his lungs.
Right. So Isaac has to choose. He quits the factory to save his own life. He buys one horse jack and a wagon and starts selling produce door to door. Then he marries Zaruhi, or Rose, and buys 3 cows.
And that's the start of it all. The seed of the dairy dynasty.
The growth is just staggering. The book says they go from those 3 cows to 3,000. They become the largest private dairy in the world. They create the Reliance brand.
How does the book explain that kind of scaling?
Well, a business school would talk about market fit and vertical integration, but the text attributes it to a specific promise. Isaac gets a word from his church elders based on Deuteronomy 28.
For those of us who aren't biblical scholars, what's Deuteronomy 28?
It's a chapter in the Old Testament that basically says, if you obey God, he will bless the fruit of your cattle and your storehouses. So for the Shakarians, every calf born, every gallon of milk, it wasn't just profit.
It was proof.
It was theological proof. It was fulfillment of a divine contract.
Okay, so enter our narrator, the younger Demos Shakarian, born in 1913. He's growing up in the middle of this booming empire. But he had his own struggles.
He did. He was partially deaf as a kid. And the book describes this moment when he's 13. He feels this sensation like a warm blanket settling over him, and poof, his hearing is instantly restored.
It just reinforces that theme again. Mm-hmm. For this family, the supernatural is just normal.
It's part of daily operations, like milking the cows.
But you have this culture clash, right? They're becoming these wealthy American businessmen driving nice cars, but their home life sounds like it's from another century.
Oh, incredibly insular. You see it so clearly in Demos's marriage. It was an arranged marriage to Rose Gabrielian. They're living in modern Los Angeles, but they're following these old village customs. They didn't even speak to each other until the engagement was basically a done deal.
It's so wild to think about. Living in LA in the 1930s, but your life is governed by 1800s Armenian rules.
But the source makes the point that this was a survival mechanism. They survived a genocide by sticking together, by guarding their culture. Eventually, though, that bubble had to burst if they were going to really engage with America.
Which brings us to the turning point, because prosperity can be its own kind of danger. The business is exploding, feedlots, haulage, more dairies. And Demos says he started to feel spiritually complacent, successful, but distracted.
And he notices something at church meetings. He looks around at the audience and sees a real demographic skew.
Yeah, he says it's mostly women.
Heavily, like 90%. A mentor of his, Dr. Charles Price, explains why. He says American men think religion is sissy. It's for women and children. The men do the real work business, building society. This really bothered Demos. And what forced the issue was tragedy.
This is the heavy part of the story. The death of his daughter, Carolyn.
It really is the emotional anchor of the whole narrative. She dies of pneumonia, and Demos and his wife Rose are just shattered. The book says this grief forced a total reprioritization. They've been planning this big dream house.
Focusing on their wealth.
Exactly. After Carolyn dies, they stop all the plans. They just end up on their living room rug praying and deciding God has to come before the business, not after.
And it's interesting because they prayed for Carolyn to be healed, and she wasn't. But then there's this contrasting story right after about his sister Florence.
Yes. Florence had a shattered pelvis in a car accident. Doctor said it was hopeless. She'd be disabled for life. They pray, and the text says her bones literally remodel and heal overnight.
So you have this tragic loss and then this miracle back to back.
Exactly. And the takeaway seems to be that Shakarian's worldview sees God as sovereign, not as some cosmic vending machine. You don't just put in a prayer and get a miracle every time. It was the reliance, the relationship that mattered most.
Speaking of reliance, let's go back to the cows. Because there's this story about a tuberculosis outbreak that puts this whole business versus faith thing to the ultimate test.
This is where the rubber really meets the road. At the time, TB was sweeping through cattle herds in California. It was an epidemic. If your cows tested positive or even suspect, The state inspectors would just slaughter the whole herd.
So from a business perspective, this is bankruptcy knocking on your door.
Total ruin.
Yeah.
At their Reliance number 3 dairy, the inspectors were ready to wipe them out. And instead of, trying to bribe someone or hiding the cows, they call a preacher.
They call in a preacher to deal with a public health crisis.
They call Dr. Kelso Glover. And he stands there in the corral with all these sick animals and prays this very specific prayer. The cattle on 1,000 hills are yours. He's basically claiming the cows for God, arguing God has a stake in the business.
And the result?
0 reactors. In a herd of thousands that had shown clear signs of infection, the inspectors found nothing.
Oh.
The source claims it was a medical impossibility. The vets were just baffled.
That is just incredible. But I want to push back a bit, because it can't be that everything they touched turned to gold just because they prayed.
Right.
Let's talk about the milling disaster. This is where Demos gets it really wrong.
This is a fascinating case study in maybe hubris. Demos decides to expand into grain milling. It's vertical integration. Makes sense on paper, right? He owns the cows, why not own the feed? But he's speculating. He buys huge amounts of grain, assuming prices will go up when a government price ceiling lifts.
I know just enough about economics to know that's a huge gamble.
And he crashes. Hard. The prices drop instead of rising. He's losing between $10,000 and $50,000 a week.
In the 1940s, that's an astronomical amount of money.
She's bleeding out. And the context is so dramatic. While his business is collapsing, he's off running a religious campaign in Fresno. Then his son gets dangerously sick. It feels like everything is falling apart at once.
Right.
He actually hears a voice. It tells him, quit the campaign, go save your business. But he realizes, or discerns, that this voice is deceptive. He thinks it's a distraction, maybe Satan. So he doubles down and stays, and his son recovers. But the business, that's where the real lesson comes.
Yeah, God doesn't just magically fix the business, does he?
No. Demos gets this specific insight from God: I will never give you full time for any business. The message was clear. Demos wasn't meant to be a tycoon first. He was meant to be a witness who happened to be in business. He had to sell the mill.
And even the sale is described as a miracle. Some buyer wakes up in the middle of the night, feels compelled to buy it at Demos' exact price.
It saved them from ruin, but it sealed the lesson. The business was a tool, it wasn't the master. He had to hold it loosely.
So Demos realizes he's not a miller. He also realizes he's not a preacher. He tries to preach once and just freezes up, terrified of public speaking.
Which leads to this identity crisis.
Yeah.
If he's not a clergyman and he's not just a businessman, then what is he? The answer comes to him at this huge event at the Hollywood Bowl.
Set the scene for us.
It's a massive rally. Demos is looking out at this huge crowd. They do a candle lighting ceremony, and he sees thousands of these tiny flames lighting up the darkness, and he has this epiphany. He is a helper.
The helper. That sounds almost secondary, like a sidekick.
It sounds humble, but he finds it in the Bible. He realizes his gift isn't to be the star on stage. It's to be the catalyst, to set the stage, pay the bills, organize. And he realizes if he can get businessmen to talk to other businessmen, that's a group the church completely misses.
Because, going back to that sissy religion idea.
Exactly. A plumber will listen to another plumber. A banker will listen to another banker. If a preacher tells you to have faith, well, that's his job. But if a guy who runs a steel mill tells you how faith saved his marriage, you listen differently.
So he founds the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International.
FGBMFI. It's a terrible acronym.
A real mouthful.
But a powerful concept. And honestly, the first meeting is a total flop.
It's at Clifton's Cafeteria in L.A. You can just picture it. They expect this huge crowd, and they get, 21 people?
And that includes Demos and the main speaker, Oral Roberts. It was so discouraging. But this is where the vision part comes back in. Oral Roberts plays this prayer, the dream of 1,000. He sees 1,000 chapters of this group all over the world, and the men start marching in place right there in the cafeteria singing, "Onward, Christian Soldiers."
It sounds a little silly, grown men marching in a cafeteria.
It does, but for them, it was like spiritual warfare. They were claiming territory. But it didn't happen overnight. That first year was a failure. Pastors actually opposed it. They thought Demos was trying to steal their wealthy donors. He spent his own money flying around the country, getting rejected.
But he kept going back to that prophecy from his mentor, Charles Price.
The all-flesh prophecy. Price had predicted that the next great move of God wouldn't come from the clergy, the professionals. It would come from ordinary flesh. Shopkeepers, factory workers, dairy farmers. Demos realized he was that. He and his friends were the mechanism.
So if you zoom out, you have this incredible arc. We started in a village in Armenia with a boy drawing a map on a plank of wood. We end up with a global movement of businessmen meeting in hotels and cafeterias, all claiming that the marketplace is holy ground.
That is the core takeaway. The Shakarian story just challenges this idea that your secular work and your spiritual life are in two separate boxes. For Demos, the dairy was a spiritual venue. The cattle were God's cattle. The business deals were subject to spiritual laws.
It's a shortcut to understanding the history of the charismatic movement, but from a totally different angle. Not from the pulpit, but from the boardroom.
Exactly. It kind of democratized the supernatural. You didn't have to be a monk in a monastery. You could be a guy in a suit running a business.
So what does this all mean for us listening today? This is where the source material leaves us with a really provocative thought.
Right. Shakarian saw that the church was filled with women. They were the ones keeping the spiritual fires burning. But he asked, what happens to a society when the men, the builders, the architects, the businessmen, what happens when they finally decide to engage with the spiritual?
He describes it as all this untapped energy just sitting in offices and factories.
Think about it. Imagine the energy of, I don't know, the Manhattan Project or Silicon Valley, but applied to spiritual renewal. That was Demos Shakarian's vision. Not just making money, but lighting all those candles in the Hollywood bowl. He believed that if the builders of society actually woke up, they could change the world faster than any sermon.
It really makes you wonder what untapped energy is sitting in your own office right now, just waiting for a spark. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the happiest people on earth. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Okay,